Randy and mostly Randy did yeoman's work, kind of explaining carbon cycle and plants and soils. And I know I learned a lot in working alongside Randy, thinking about that. So we just wanted to help clarify some of the concepts that you all were introduced to that maybe weren't so clear. So with Randy's help here, he'll help me navigate kind of this white board to kind of reinforce some of the ideas. So let's start with this. Okay, here we go. This is our ecosystem. We're going to grow a plant on it. And as I keep telling people, I only know how to draw one type of plant, maybe two types of plants.
Here's our lot of clovers
right here. Oh, I got to add a clover.
Yeah, it looks like a clover.
Okay,
now it would need another leaf. Oh, there we go. Okay, there we go.
They have an above ground component, and of course they have below ground components, the roots, the rooting system, and the below ground parts or the below ground food webs and the below ground community is sometimes referred to as the brown food web, because it's built on things that are below ground, often, dead. And the above ground parts are
because it's dark down there. That's why.
That would be the black food web here.
It's dark.
So above
what
ground.
You just drew, Claudio, what you just drew was the plant biomass, the above ground and the below ground plant biomass.
Yep.
And I just want to say that biomass is about 50% carbon. So when we talk about the carbon cycle, this is a critical starting point, that those plants have built their biomass by taking carbon out of the atmosphere, CO2, and turning it into biomass. The rest of the plant, of course, is all kinds of nutrients and water and other stuff that's flown around in the cells. But most of it, about 50%, a little bit more, it ranges from 51 to 55% of a plant is carbon. We talked in that video about how the plant does this photosynthesis, right? It takes that carbon dioxide that moves across stomates on the plant leaves, these little tiny holes in the plant leaves. That carbon moves across those holes, and then the plant takes it from there. It takes that CO2 and it breaks it apart, and it takes that carbon from the CO2 and attaches it to a 5-carbon chain that the plant has made from sugar that's already in the plant. And then it splits that, what is now a 6-carbon chain, in half and uses those 3-carbon chains to make the biomass, but it also recycles some of it to build those 5-carbon chains to come back around, and that's called the Calvin cycle. Beyond the scope of the class, really, but important to understand from a plant biology perspective that it's recycling carbon in order to build its own biomass internally, but it's taking up carbon from the atmosphere. And then it's shunting that carbon below ground and to the leaves and to different places and responding to the environmental signals that it's getting. And we talked about that in the videos. Carbon allocation. Nice drawing,
Randy,
Claudio.
Before we go there, so one of the things that maybe we didn't say too much on the having to do with plants and photosynthesis, and it actually is relevant in the next part that we're going to talk about, which is what happens in the soils, is that plants take up that carbon dioxide, they combine it with the existing carbon that's there, but ultimately create these chains of carbon that are the structures of the plant. And that's what happens during the day. But the plant also has to maintain itself. It has to regulate the osmotic gradients that exist there. It has to move water around. And that takes energy, and that actually requires a breakdown of some of that carbon. So when the plant does that, it respires, it generates carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So there's a little bit of CO2 that will be generated as the plants try to maintain that physiological machinery of the plants. So they take
Claudio,
in carbon dioxide.
I wouldn't even call it a little bit, Claudio. I'd say it's roughly half.
Yep, that's right. So they take in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, they generate oxygen, but then they have to use up some of this energy that they've stored in these carbon-containing molecules in order to maintain themselves. And in the process of doing that, they liberate carbon back into the atmosphere. And to do that, they actually use up oxygen, to do that. And that's respiration. And so the balance between what they take in and what they use up to maintain themselves, it's what's left over for the plant to do things with it, to grow tissues, to grow more leaves, to grow a fruiting body, or to grow the roots and things like that.
And so that balance,
yep.
That balance is called net primary productivity.
There we go. Net primary productivity.
NPP.
NPP. Yeah.
NPP. This is an important thing, because that's what's left over that makes the products and makes the biomass that we can also utilize as part of agriculture, or feed to our animals, or use directly ourselves. So it's the in minus out is what's left over, is that NPP. Okay.
Critically, so that's the in minus out at the plant level.
Yes.
But now if we expand to the ecosystem level, which is I think where you're going.
Yep.
We have the same sort of cosmic balance going on there.
Let's carry that thread through. So the plant, parts of the plant die. Okay, so let me draw my leaf here, hitting the surface of the soil. This is the soil surface right here. And let me make this one brown, because now this leaf is dead right here. And some of these roots die, and you talked about turnover of the roots. The roots are kind of go out looking for nutrients, and if they can't find it, they get sloughed off, and then the plant allocates roots in other directions. So there's a lot of little bits of roots that are kind of left over, here. So by how the plant is growing, there is an input of this dead material into the soil matrix, into the soil area. So what happens at that point? So now there's all this carbon and proteins. And proteins, remember, have carbon and nitrogen in them. Remember? All of this stuff here is potential food for heterotrophs. All those things that can't photosynthesize and make energy or capture energy from the sun's energy. And so here you've got, little things like microbes, and I don't know what microbes look like, but, maybe they're little rod-shaped things with little, flagella that come out of them.
That's exactly what they look like.
Okay, cool. There's mushrooms, and this is my best version of a mushroom right here. And the mushrooms that we see, the stuff that we see above ground.
I always thought you were a fun guy, Claudio.
Oh, thank you. Never hurts to have a dad joke in there.
Bad joke. Hey, but one thing on the subject of the carbon, we might ask people about, or talk a little bit about why we need carbon in the soil, because the plant doesn't actually get the carbon from the soil. It's from the air.
That's right.
Right.
And that people are often confused about that point. So I wonder if that's worth spending a minute on.
I think that's where we're going, that these plants are sort of the pump. People who study microbiology, actually, soil microbiology, often say that plants are really just a carbon pump. They're trying to get carbon from the atmosphere into the soil so that the microbes can do their business with it. And the business that they're trying to do, of course, is to build their own bodies. They can't photosynthesize, so they're heterotrophs. So they have to go and consume, basically, that dead carbon that entered into the detrital pool as plant litter. Claudio, your artistic skills are outstanding.
Can you tell me what this thing is?
That carrot?
Oh, come on, jeez.
So you've got a question about whether roots produce oxygen.
Yes. Yeah.
There is oxygen diffusing out of the roots, but there's also CO2 diffusing out of the roots as well. So anywhere that there's respiration going on, you're losing both those gases.
Yep. So just to kind of continue this set. So what we're drawing here, this all this goodies over here on this side are the biota, are the organisms that are taking advantage of this carbon and nitrogen that is getting shunted from the atmosphere, as Randy pointed out, into this soil environment. We got bacteria, we've got fungi, and the business end of fungi, I guess it depends what you mean by what I mean by business end. Often we see fungi as the above ground parts, the mushrooms and the caps, and this is the stuff we eat. Don't eat the ones that look like this. This one will kill you here.
That's the reproductive part of the fungi.
Those are the reproductive parts. Those are the parts that put the spores out into the environment and end up, I guess there's some sexual reproduction that happens there somehow. And that's where they sprinkle around into the remainder into the other parts of the soil environment. But really the business end is all these little filamentous hyphae that occur on the surface or mainly below ground that are out there scavenging for dead things, looking to capture and suck off that nitrogen and that carbon into them. So bacteria and fungi are kind of the business end of that breakdown process from that litter that is entering the soil system.
And in a large part, you can think of those as more or less sequential breakdown pathways. So the fungi are helping to attack stuff that's hard to break down. It's recalcitrant. And part of the reason that they can do that is because they are eukaryotic. They're multicellular. They have this ability to go get carbon in one part of the soil and nitrogen in another part of the soil and phosphorus in another part of the soil, just like a plant, and bring it all together to build their own bodies. Bacteria, on the other hand, are little tiny microscopic critters that are very confined to the little nooks and crannies they're in the soil. And so if they don't have everything they need right there next to their body, then they probably aren't going to survive, and they aren't going to reproduce, and they aren't going to grow. So the fungi play a critical role in sort of taking that plant litter and blending it up pretty much for the bacteria. And then the bacteria take advantage of what the fungi put out.
Mm-hmm. So go ahead, Ben.
Just to keeping an eye on the clock. So what does all of this have to do with the balance of carbon in the soil versus in the air, and how does that all work?
Well, I thought you'd never ask. That is a great question. Randy.
Well, like the plants, those microorganisms, the fungi, the bacteria, as well as the earthworms, as they take in that carbon, they're also burning carbon, respiring carbon, in order to maintain their own biomass. And so they're emitting CO2, just like the plant's emitting CO2 as respiration. So that's heterotrophic respiration from the ecosystem. Some of the carbon that comes into their biomass, if I'm a little bacterium, I build my biomass and then I die, my cell wall just sort of splats out into the soil matrix. Other microbes can take it up, or it gets sort of protected or trapped in the soil. And that's what we want to do. When we build organic matter, we're trying to trap carbon in the soil before it respires off to the atmosphere. So one of the terms you might hear a lot about is carbon sequestration. And carbon sequestration is bringing more carbon in via plant fixation than is being respired by microbial respiration. One of the rubs in agricultural systems is that the things we do that increase nutrient availability for the plants also stimulate microbial respiration. So think about adding nutrients to the system. That stimulates plant productivity, but it also stimulates the microbes. And when it stimulates the microbes, they're gassing off more CO2. When we till the soil, when we turn it and disturb it, that liberates nutrients for the plants, which is a benefit for us humans. But if we do too much of it, those microbes go crazy and liberate a bunch of carbon that otherwise would have been trapped. So there really is this sort of tension between making nutrients available for plant growth and holding carbon in the system. Claudio is drawing a picture of a bathtub. I recognize it from a mile away.
This is what my bathtub looks like. So you could think of this as,
Or a sink, carbon.
or the sink.
Might be
Yeah.
a carbon sink.
You could think of this as, you know, the amount of carbon that you have in the system is like the level of water that you have in a sink or in your bathtub. And the inputs here are things like plant litter. And this is like dead leaves or the dead roots or the dead bodies of microbes. Those are all sorts of things. Now, that's a carbon pool that could get used. If it gets used, it gets burnt off as CO2 by respiration, by other heterotrophs. Respiration, right here. So if you're trying to build this pool right here of carbon in the soil, for example, just like we were talking about before with the atmosphere, if you're trying to, or with the plants, if you want this to grow, then your inputs had better be bigger than your outputs right here. So any kind of management that we do that accelerates respiration is going to shrink this pool if this doesn't change over here, if the inputs don't change. Now,
Looks like
there's
my
a reason
bank, yeah.
why sometimes you want microbial activity to be really rapid, and that is at the same time that they're burning off, that they're using carbon and burning off carbon dioxide, they're also getting access to that nitrogen right here, the things that they need to build their proteins. When this nitrogen gets liberated, well, the microbes can take advantage of some of that, but then it's labile, and so the plants can take some of that as well. So that freely available nitrogen during that phase when it's been broken apart from these other structures is what feeds the activity, the nitrogen demands of plants. So that's that tension that Randy was talking about, that you want microbial activity to be happening, you want carbon to be building up in the soils, but if it's too bound up, then there's no nitrogen to make it to the plants. And now we've got an issue there in terms of the nitrogen demands of the plants. Anything else you want to say about that, Randy?
I'm just going to say I'm never going to call it a carbon sink or a carbon pool again. From now on, I'm only going to call it a carbon bathtub. A new technical term. I'm sure we'll see it in the literature soon.
Just so we have
I just want to.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Ben. No, go ahead, Ben.
I think Ben's trying to get us to move along. But
yeah, I was just going to say, I think if you have questions and that we could address quickly, maybe type them in the chat. But otherwise, I think we should move on.
Thank you, Ben. I love it that you're the MC and keep us on task.